Push, Sarah. One more big push, Dr. Martinez called out from his position at the foot of the bed. Sarah Williams clutched the metal rails of the hospital bed, her knuckles drained of color as another wave of contractions ripped through her body. At 38, this was supposed to be her miracle, the child she had been waiting for across 15 years of heartbreak and longing. Her entire world had shrunk down to this single moment. The agony, the anticipation, the fragile hope that maybe this time everything would finally fall into place. "Where is he?" Sarah gasped between ragged breaths. "Where is my husband?" The delivery room door flew open with enough force to bang hard against the wall. Richard Williams strode inside, his expensive Italian suit creased and disheveled, his face flushed with irritation rather than the joy Sarah had always imagined seeing there. His Rolex caught the sharp glare of the fluorescent lights as he checked the time with barely concealed annoyance. "Finally decided to show up," Sarah managed through gritted teeth, doing her best to mask the hurt hiding just beneath her words. "Don't start with me, Sarah. I was right in the middle of closing the Morrison deal when you decided to go into labor." Richard's voice carried that familiar edge of blame, the one that always made Sarah's stomach tighten into a knot. "Couldn't you have waited until Monday?" Dr. Martinez looked up sharply from his position. "Sir, your wife needs your support right now. She has been in labor for 18 hours. She needs to understand that some things are more important than her timing." Richard snapped, tugging loose his silk tie as though the very act of standing in a delivery room was suffocating him. Sarah felt tears mixing with the sweat on her cheeks. This was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. She had dreamed of this moment through countless failed fertility treatments, 3 devastating miscarriages, and years of Richard's deepening coldness. In her imagination, he would hold her hand, whisper words of encouragement, maybe even shed tears of joy when their baby finally came into the world. "The baby's crowning, Doctor," Martinez announced, his voice charged with professional excitement. "Sarah, give me everything you've got. Your daughter is almost here." Sarah pushed with every last bit of strength she had, her mind fixed on the tiny life about to enter the world, a life she had already loved fiercely for 9 months. She had spoken to her belly every single morning, played Mozart while she worked in her garden, and spent countless hours dreaming of the family they would finally become. "It's a girl!" Dr. Martinez lifted the crying infant, her small fists waving in the air. "She's beautiful and healthy. Perfect. 10 fingers and 10 toes." Sarah reached out with trembling arms, tears pouring freely down her face. "My baby girl. My Emma." The name they had chosen together during one of their rare, peaceful moments. Sitting in the nursery they had painted soft yellow because they had wanted to be surprised. But Richard's voice sliced through her joy like a blade. "A girl. We talked about this, Sarah. I need a son, someone to carry on the Williams name and take over the business." The words struck her like physical blows. She had carried this child for 9 months, endured morning sickness that lasted all day, swollen ankles, sleepless nights, and a difficult pregnancy that had confined her to bed rest for the final month. And his very first words were disappointment. "Richard, please," Sarah whispered, still reaching for their daughter. "Just hold her. Look at how perfect she is." "No." Richard's voice was ice cold, colder than she had ever heard it. "This is just another one of your failures, Sarah. First, you can't get pregnant naturally. Then, you lose 3 babies. And now, when you finally manage to carry one to term, it isn't even what I asked for." Around them, the medical staff had gone completely silent, their faces pale with shock at the cruelty in Richard's words. Dr. Martinez held baby Emma protectively against him, his dark eyes flickering with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite name. "Mr. Williams," Dr. Martinez said firmly, stepping slightly between Richard and Sarah, "your daughter is perfect and healthy. Your wife just endured 18 hours of labor to bring this beautiful child into the world. Perhaps you might want to—" "Don't tell me about my wife," Richard snarled, his face reddening. And don't tell me about this disappointment. I specifically told Sarah I needed a male heir. Instead, she gives me another mouth to feed with nothing to offer my legacy. Sarah felt something breaking inside her chest. Not just her heart, but something deeper. Some final thread of hope that had been holding their marriage together, despite years of emotional abuse, financial control, and her slow, painful isolation from everyone she had once loved. Then he did something that would haunt Sarah forever and alter the course of 3 lives in ways none of them could have imagined. The slap cracked through the delivery room like a gunshot. Sarah's head snapped sideways, her cheek blazing from the force of Richard's open palm. The heart monitor that had been steadily tracking her vital signs suddenly began racing as her blood pressure spiked into a dangerous range. "That's what I think of you and your useless daughter," Richard said, flexing his fingers as though the slap had somehow hurt his hand. Dr. Martinez moved with remarkable speed for a man in his 60s, placing himself squarely between Richard and Sarah while still cradling the crying newborn. "Security, I need security in delivery room 3, immediately." The 2 nurses in the room had gone pale with shock. One was already reaching for the emergency button on the wall, while the other rushed to check Sarah's vital signs. Sarah touched her burning cheek with trembling fingers, her newborn daughter still crying in Dr. Martinez's protective arms. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't the family she had spent years dreaming of during those long, lonely nights when Richard worked late or traveled on business. "Get out," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did you say?" Richard demanded, moving closer despite Dr. Martinez's protective stance. "I said get out." Sarah's voice rose to a shout that seemed to surprise even herself. "Get out and don't come back. Get out and stay away from my daughter." Security guards appeared in the doorway within seconds, their hands already moving toward their radios as they read the room. The head of security, a woman named Captain Rodriguez, took one look at Sarah's reddened cheek and Richard's defensive posture and understood exactly what had happened. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us," Captain Rodriguez said, in a tone that left no room for argument. "This is my wife and my child," Richard protested, but his bluster was already deflating as he became aware of how his actions appeared to a room full of witnesses. "Sir, you just committed assault in front of multiple medical professionals. You can leave voluntarily with us right now, or we can call the police and you can leave in handcuffs. Your choice." As security escorted her millionaire husband from the room, Sarah had no idea that Dr. Martinez, the man now gently placing her daughter in her arms, was about to reveal a secret that would redefine everything she believed she knew about her life, her family, and her future. The door closed behind Richard with a soft click, and suddenly the room felt peaceful despite everything that had just taken place. Dr. Martinez carefully settled baby Emma in Sarah's arms, his hands steady and gentle. "He's gone," Dr. Martinez said softly. "And Sarah, I want you to know something. What just happened in this room had nothing to do with you or your beautiful daughter. That was a small, cruel man who just exposed his true character in front of a room full of people who will never forget it." Sarah looked down at Emma's perfect face, her daughter's crying gradually quieting as she settled against her mother's chest. Despite the burning in her cheek and the turmoil in her heart, Sarah felt something entirely unexpected: relief. For the first time in 15 years of marriage, she didn't have to apologize for simply existing. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in her private room on the maternity ward, little Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. The bruise on her cheek had deepened to a dark purple, and every time she brushed it with her fingertips, she felt fresh waves of humiliation mingled with something she was slowly beginning to recognize as liberation. The nursing staff had been extraordinarily kind, bringing ice packs and quiet words of support. Captain Rodriguez had stopped by to let her know that the hospital security footage had captured everything, and that charges could be filed if Sarah chose to pursue them. But mostly, Sarah just wanted to hold her daughter and figure out what came next. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called softly, careful not to wake Emma. Dr. Martinez entered, but something about him seemed different now. He had changed out of his scrubs into an expensive-looking charcoal suit that fit him impeccably. His posture seemed more formal, more commanding, and when he moved there was a quiet confidence that spoke of real authority. "How are you feeling, Sarah?" His accent sounded less pronounced now, more refined, as though he had been unconsciously shifting registers during the delivery. "Like my world just fell apart," she admitted. Then she quickly added, "Dr. Martinez, I'm so sorry about what happened in there. Richard isn't usually—" She stopped herself, recognizing the lie before it could fully form. Richard was exactly like that. She had simply become an expert at hiding it. "Actually, he is usually like that, isn't he?" Dr. Martinez pulled the visitor's chair up beside her bed and sat down with the unhurried grace of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Sarah, may I speak freely?" She nodded, adjusting Emma in her arms and wondering why this conversation already felt different from any doctor and patient interaction she had ever had. "I've been watching you for months during your prenatal visits. The way you flinch when your phone rings. The way you apologize for everything, even things that aren't remotely your fault. The way you explain away bruises that appear and disappear between appointments." Sarah's throat tightened. No one had ever named the reality of her marriage so directly. "I don't know what you mean. Your husband hits you regularly, doesn't he? Today wasn't the first time." Dr. Martinez's voice was gentle but unwavering. "And I know something about abuse because I grew up watching it destroy my mother. I recognize the signs because I live with them every single day for the first 18 years of my life." The words hung in the air like an accusation Sarah couldn't bring herself to deny. She looked down at Emma's perfect tiny face, unable to meet the doctor's eyes. "It's complicated," she whispered. "No, Sarah, it's not complicated. It's abuse." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, his dark eyes intense but filled with kindness. "And what makes it worse is that you've been conditioned to believe you deserve it, that it's somehow your fault, that if you could just be better or stronger or more perfect, it would stop." Sarah felt the tears beginning again. This stranger was describing her life with an accuracy that was both frightening and oddly comforting. "You don't understand," she said. "Richard controls everything. The house, the money, the cars. I don't even have access to our bank accounts. If I leave, where would Emma and I go? How would we survive? How do you walk away from someone who controls everything? Your money, your friends, your entire sense of who you are. How do you start over when you can't even remember who you were before?" Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words with great care. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight Sarah couldn't quite place. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you months ago, but I needed to be absolutely certain first. I needed time to process what I suspected and to figure out the right way to handle it." He paused, running a hand through his silver hair in a gesture that struck Sarah as somehow familiar. "My name isn't simply Dr. Eduardo Martinez. It's Dr. Eduardo Martinez Blackwell." The name hit her like a bolt of lightning. Everyone in New York knew that name. Blackwell Industries was one of the largest privately held companies in America, with interests spanning real estate, technology, and renewable energy. She had read about Eduardo Blackwell in Forbes magazine just the previous month, a feature article about billionaire philanthropists who were quietly reshaping the world. "That's impossible," she breathed, staring at this man who had just delivered her baby and was now claiming to be one of the wealthiest people in the country. 24 years ago, I had a relationship with a young woman named Margaret Thompson. She was 19. I was 25 and just beginning medical school. We met at a coffee shop near Columbia, where I was working weekends to pay my tuition. Sarah's heart began to race for reasons she couldn't quite identify. Her mother's maiden name had been Thompson. Her mother had been 19 when Sarah was born. But her mother was dead. She had died in a car accident when Sarah was 18. When Margaret told me she was pregnant, I begged her to marry me. I was ready to drop out of medical school, find multiple jobs, do whatever it took to support our family. But her parents believed I was just some poor kid from Mexico chasing their money. The room seemed to spin around her. "No," she whispered. But even as she said it, pieces were clicking into place. Her mother's mysterious past that was never discussed. The way Margaret had always changed the subject when Sarah asked about her father. The hushed phone calls that ended abruptly whenever Sarah walked into the room. They paid her $5,000 to disappear. They told her they would disown her if she ever contacted me again, and that they would ensure I never became a doctor if she didn't cooperate. She took the money and vanished. I spent years trying to find her, but she had changed her name and married someone else. Margaret Thompson became Margaret Williams when she married your stepfather. She told him you were his daughter. You were 3 years old at the time, just a little girl who needed a father figure. Sarah felt as though she were drowning. "You're saying you're my—" "I'm your father, Sarah. I've been looking for you for 24 years. Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, making soft baby sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Dr. Martinez, her father, looked at his granddaughter with tears in his eyes that he was working hard to hold back. "I knew the moment you walked into my office 6 months ago for your first prenatal appointment. You have your mother's eyes and her smile, but you have my hands and my stubborn chin. See?" He held his hands up next to hers. The similarity was undeniable. The same long fingers, the same square palms, and even the same small scar on the index finger from a childhood accident. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I needed to be absolutely certain. I had DNA testing done on some routine blood work during your second visit. The results came back 3 months ago." Eduardo reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. "Sarah Thompson Williams, you are my daughter, and this beautiful little girl is my granddaughter." Sarah felt the world shifting beneath her like the ground during an earthquake. Her entire life had been built on lies, but perhaps for the first time in years, she was no longer alone. "What does this mean?" she asked, looking between the DNA results and this man who was apparently her father. Eduardo reached into his jacket again and pulled out a business card. But this was no ordinary medical card. It was heavy cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing that read, "Eduardo Martinez Blackwell, Chief Executive Officer, Blackwell Industries." "It means you never have to be afraid of Richard Williams again," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to wielding real power. "It means you have family who will protect you and Emma. And it means that the life you believed you were trapped in was only the prologue to the story you were truly meant to live." Sarah stared at the business card, struggling to absorb the magnitude of what she was hearing. Her millionaire husband had just revealed himself to be an abusive monster, and the doctor who had delivered her baby had just revealed himself to be her billionaire father. Emma made a contented sound in her sleep, and Sarah looked down at her daughter with a sense of wonder that felt entirely new. This little girl would never know what it felt like to be powerless, to be trapped, to believe she deserved less than every beautiful thing the world had to offer. "Eduardo," Sarah said, testing the name on her lips. "Dad, what happens now?" Eduardo smiled, and for the first time Sarah could see her own smile reflected back at her. "Now, my dear daughter, we go home, and we start building the life you and Emma deserve." The following morning, Sarah looked out the window of the private car Eduardo had arranged for her. She was being discharged from the hospital, but instead of returning to the mansion in Westchester she had shared with Richard, she was heading to a penthouse apartment in Manhattan that Eduardo kept for out-of-town guests. The transition felt completely surreal. 24 hours ago, she had been Sarah Williams, the trapped wife of a moderately successful real estate developer. Now she was apparently Sarah Martinez, daughter of one of the most powerful men in America, with access to resources she could barely begin to comprehend. Mrs. Williams, the driver, a kind-faced man named James, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Mr. Blackwell wanted me to let you know that everything has been prepared for you and the baby. Nursery supplies, clothing, whatever you need. If there's anything specific you'd like, please just let me know." Sarah adjusted Emma in her arms, marveling at how peaceful her daughter looked despite the chaos surrounding her birth. "James, can I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am. How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwell?" 15 years now. He's a good man, Mrs. Williams. Tough in business, but fair. Loyal to the people who matter to him. And he's been talking about finding you for as long as I've known him." James navigated the morning traffic with practiced ease, pointing out landmarks as they made their way into Manhattan. "He had private investigators working your case for years," he added. "Never gave up hope that someday he'd find you and your mother." The car pulled up to a gleaming glass tower on the Upper East Side. The doorman, who was clearly expecting them, hurried over to assist with Sarah's bags, which weren't many since she had refused to take anything from the Westchester house except Emma's clothing and a few personal items. "Welcome home, Miss Blackwell," the doorman said with a warm smile that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Miss Blackwell. Sarah had never heard those words before, but they sent a strange thrill through her. Not Mrs. Williams, not someone defined entirely by her marriage to a man who treated her like property, but Miss Blackwell, a person in her own right, with her own identity, her own name, her own standing. The penthouse elevator opened directly into the apartment, and Sarah stepped out with a sharp intake of breath that made Emma stir against her chest. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park, the trees just beginning to glow with their autumn colors. The space was elegantly furnished but felt warm and welcoming, nothing like the cold, showroom perfection Richard had always preferred for their home. "Sarah." Eduardo appeared from what looked like a home office, his face lighting up at the sight of her and Emma. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt, looking more like someone's favorite uncle than one of the most powerful men in the country. "How are you feeling? How's my granddaughter?" "We're both fine," Sarah said, though she felt anything but. The events of the past day kept crashing over her in waves. The violence of Richard's reaction, the revelation about Eduardo's identity, the complete upheaval of everything she thought she had understood about her own life. "Eduardo, this is all so overwhelming. Yesterday I didn't even know you existed. And now? Now you are discovering that your life can look completely different from anything you ever imagined possible." Eduardo gently touched Emma's tiny hand with one finger, his expression soft with wonder. "I know it's a great deal to process, but I need you to understand something fundamental. You don't have to go back to him. Ever. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Sarah sank into one of the plush armchairs with Emma cradled against her chest. "It's not that simple, Eduardo. Richard won't just let me go. He's used to getting exactly what he wants, and he doesn't handle rejection well. When I don't come home today, when I don't answer his calls, he's going to escalate." Eduardo's expression hardened slightly. "Richard Williams is worth approximately $50 million, most of it tied up in real estate and investments that could disappear overnight if the right kind of pressure were applied." He paused, meeting Sarah's eyes directly. "I'm worth $15 billion in liquid assets alone." The numbers were so enormous Sarah could barely take them in. The difference between $50 million and $15 billion was like the difference between a puddle and an ocean. "I'm not trying to intimidate you with money," Eduardo continued, settling into the chair across from her. "I'm trying to show you that you have options now, real options, the kind that come with real power." Sarah's phone, which had been mercifully silent during the drive from the hospital, suddenly erupted with Richard's ringtone. She stared at the screen and felt her stomach clench with the familiar fear she had spent years trying to manage, a reflex built up through years of walking on eggshells. "Don't answer it," Eduardo said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of steady authority that never needed to be raised to be heard. "But if I don't, he'll only get angrier. And when he gets angry, Sarah, look at me. Eduardo's voice was firm but gentle. You are not responsible for managing his emotions anymore. You are not responsible for preventing his anger or softening his reactions. That is exactly what abusers do. They condition you into believing that their feelings are your responsibility, that their violence is something you provoke rather than something they choose. The phone stopped ringing and immediately started again. Sarah watched Richard's name flashing on the screen over and over and felt something shift deep inside her chest. For the first time in 15 years, she didn't feel the automatic compulsion to answer, to apologize, to do whatever was necessary to make things better. He's going to keep calling, Sarah said, but her voice was steadier now. Then let's make sure he understands the new reality. Eduardo walked to his home office and returned with a cordless phone. James, he said, please get Michael Harrison on the line. Within minutes, Eduardo was speaking with someone in a tone that was perfectly civil, but carried unmistakable undertones of absolute authority. Michael, I need you to contact Richard Williams immediately. Yes, the real estate developer. Tell him that if he contacts my daughter again by any means whatsoever, by phone, text, email, or in person, I will personally dismantle his business and ensure he spends the next decade buried in litigation. Sarah listened in quiet amazement as her father, the words still felt foreign but increasingly right, calmly laid out the terms. She would be filing for divorce immediately. Any harassment would result in swift and serious legal action, and Richard would do well to remember that crossing the Blackwell family was a career-ending mistake. That's right, Michael. My daughter, Eduardo continued. No, this is not a negotiation. This is a statement of fact. And Mr. Williams has 48 hours to absorb this information and adjust his behavior accordingly. When Eduardo hung up, Sarah's phone had finally gone quiet. Is it really that simple? She asked, feeling as though she were watching someone perform sleight of hand. Power usually is, Sarah. The complicated part is learning when and how to use it responsibly. Eduardo sat down across from her again. But there's something else we need to discuss. Something about your future and Emma's. What do you mean? You're my only child. When I'm gone, Blackwell Industries, all of it, will be yours. But I don't want to wait until I'm dead to share my life with you. I want to be part of raising Emma, and I want you to be part of the work that gives my life its meaning. Eduardo leaned forward, his eyes lit with genuine excitement. How would you feel about becoming the vice president of the Blackwell Foundation? It's our charitable arm. We distribute $50 million every year to causes that matter deeply. Education, healthcare, women's shelters, environmental protection. The room seemed to tilt around Sarah. Vice president of a foundation that gave away more money in a single year than Richard was worth in total. I don't know anything about running a foundation, she whispered. You'll learn. And Sarah, you are going to be extraordinary at it. I can already tell. You have your mother's heart for helping people and my stubborn streak when it comes to getting things done. That is a powerful combination. Emma made a soft sound in her sleep, and both adults looked down at her with a shared sense of wonder. She was so tiny, so perfect, so completely unaware that her life had just changed in ways that would shape everything that followed. She'll never want for anything, Eduardo said quietly. Education, opportunity, the freedom to choose her own path based on her own interests and talents rather than her gender or her circumstances. Everything I wasn't able to give you. For the first time since Emma's birth, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten, the sensation of genuine hope. Not the desperate, white-knuckled hope she had survived on throughout her marriage. Not the hope that Richard would change, that things would get better, that maybe this time would be different. This was something altogether larger and more solid. This was hope backed by power, by resources, by family who chose to love and protect each other. What happens now? Sarah asked. Eduardo smiled, and she could see her own determination mirrored back at her in his expression. Now we start building the life you and Emma deserve. And if Richard Williams wants to fight that, he is about to learn what it means to take on the wrong family. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, New York City stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. Sarah was beginning to understand that she wasn't just escaping from something, she was stepping into something magnificent. Across town in his glass-walled office overlooking the Hudson River, Richard Williams was experiencing fear for what may have been the first time in his life. The call from Michael Harrison had been brief but devastating. Eduardo Martinez Blackwell, the Eduardo Martinez Blackwell, and somehow his quiet, controllable wife Sarah was connected to him. Richard had built his $50 million empire by being sharper and more ruthless than everyone around him. He had married Sarah precisely because she seemed ideally suited to his purposes. Beautiful enough to impress his clients and business partners, educated enough to hold her own at charity galas, and submissive enough to never challenge his authority or question his decisions. But in the past 24 hours, she had somehow transformed into something he didn't recognize. The Sarah he knew would have come crawling back after their confrontation at the hospital, apologizing and begging forgiveness. She certainly would not have ignored 17 phone calls and vanished with their newborn daughter. "Get me everything you can find on Sarah's family history," Richard barked into his phone to his private investigator, a man named Stevens who specialized in uncovering leverage on business rivals. "I want to know how she's connected to Blackwell Industries. Birth certificates, school records, medical records, everything. And I want it today." Richard paced behind his desk, his expensive Italian leather shoes silent against the thick Persian rug. Through his office windows, he could see construction cranes working on his latest development project, a luxury residential complex that would net him $15 million in profit if everything went according to plan. But nothing was going according to plan anymore. "Mr. Williams," his assistant's voice came through the intercom, "there's a woman here to see you. She says it's about your wife. She doesn't have an appointment, but she seems quite insistent." "Send her in," Richard said, half hoping this might be Sarah coming to her senses. The woman who entered was elegant in a way that money alone couldn't produce. Probably in her early 60s, with perfectly styled silver hair and the kind of understated jewelry that cost more than most people's annual salaries. She moved with the confidence of someone who was accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room she entered. "Mr. Williams," she said, "I'm Margaret Thompson Chen. I believe you know my daughter Sarah." Richard's mind raced. Sarah had never mentioned a mother named Margaret. According to what Sarah had always told him, her mother was dead, killed in a car accident when Sarah was 18. Her stepfather had raised her from the time she was 3. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some kind of mistake. Sarah's mother passed away when she was young." Margaret smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. It was the smile of a predator who had just cornered her prey. "That's what I told her, yes. Sometimes lies become necessary to protect the people we love, even when those lies cause their own kind of damage." She sat down without being invited, crossed her legs with practiced elegance, and studied Richard with the unhurried calm of someone examining a laboratory specimen. "You see, Mr. Williams, 24 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I was young and frightened, and I allowed my parents to convince me to give up the man I loved because they decided he wasn't good enough for our family." Richard felt a cold dread spreading through him like ice water moving slowly through his veins. "The man I loved was Eduardo Martinez. He's worth considerably more now than he was then. But even 24 years ago, my parents badly underestimated his potential. It is a mistake I have regretted every single day since." "What do you want?" Richard asked, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "I want to make amends for the damage I've caused. You see, I've been watching Sarah for years, following her life from a distance, making sure she was safe and well. And I've seen exactly what you've done to her," Margaret said, leaning forward slightly, her voice never rising above a conversational level, but somehow growing more threatening with every word. "I know about the bruises, Mr. Williams. I know about the financial control, the isolation from friends and family, the systematic erosion of her sense of self-worth. I know about the emotional abuse that has made my bright, wonderful daughter believe she is worthless. You don't know anything about my marriage. I know enough. I know that you have been hitting my daughter for years. I know that you struck her in a hospital delivery room in front of a room full of witnesses. I know that you called your newborn baby a failure. Margaret's voice remained perfectly controlled, but her eyes were as hard as cut diamonds. And now that Eduardo has found her, now that she knows who her real father is, I finally have the chance to protect her the way I should have been protecting her all along. Richard pushed back from his desk abruptly, his chair rolling into the credenza behind him. Get out of my office. Oh, I'll leave. But first, let me offer you some friendly advice. Margaret's voice remained draped in silk, the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum dressed up as a polite suggestion. Don't fight this divorce, Mr. Williams. Don't try to take custody of that baby. Don't make any moves against Sarah or Eduardo or anyone connected to the Blackwell family. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. You see, I married very well the second time around. My husband, Dr. James Chen, is one of the most prominent surgeons in this city. We move in the same social circles as the Blackwell family, the same charity boards, the same country clubs where reputation is everything, and scandal travels faster than wildfire. Margaret stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt with hands that didn't tremble in the slightest. It would be such a shame if word spread about how Richard Williams treats his wife, how he struck a woman who had just given birth to his child, how he called his newborn daughter a failure in front of an entire room of medical professionals. The color drained from Richard's face. No one would believe it. The entire delivery room staff witnessed it, Mr. Williams. Doctors, nurses, security guards, all upstanding professionals with impeccable reputations and no reason whatsoever to fabricate anything. Margaret moved toward the door and then turned back with that same predatory smile. Plus, of course, there's the security footage, high-definition video with excellent audio quality. She paused with her hand on the door handle. Sign the divorce papers when they arrive. Accept whatever settlement Sarah's lawyers put forward. Pay your child support on time and disappear from her life quietly and permanently. Do that and all of this stays private between the people who were already there. Fight it, Margaret shrugged with elegant finality. Well, let's just say that the society pages can be extraordinarily unforgiving, and my husband and I know a great many people who write for them. After she left, Richard slumped into his chair, his hands shaking as he reached for the bottle of scotch in his desk drawer. He had underestimated Sarah, and now he was paying for it. But Richard Williams had not built an empire by surrendering at the first sign of adversity. He picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer. Marcus, it's Richard. I need you to file an emergency custody petition immediately. Yes, for the baby. Tonight if possible. Richard, are you certain that's wise? If what you told me about the hospital incident is accurate, I don't care about the hospital. I am not going to let some billionaire steal my family just because he has more money than me. Sarah is clearly having some kind of breakdown, probably postpartum depression. She's been manipulated by this man who claims to be her father. Any reasonable judge will see that the baby belongs with her real family. What grounds are you planning to claim? Richard smiled grimly. Mental instability, abandonment of the marital home, kidnapping of a minor child. Take your pick. The point is to get Emma back and force Sarah to come home where she belongs. As he ended the call, some of his confidence returned. Eduardo Martinez Blackwell might have billions of dollars, but Richard had something more powerful, the legal system. And in family court, money didn't always decide the outcome. Sometimes the biological father who could present himself as the stable, concerned parent had the upper hand. He opened his laptop and began drafting notes for his custody petition. By tomorrow morning, he would have filed papers that would bring Sarah and Emma back where they belonged. And if Eduardo Blackwell wanted to fight him for his own family, Richard would show him what happened when outsiders tried to interfere with a man's marriage. This was far from over. He's filed for what? Sarah's voice rose in disbelief as she sat in the elegant conference room of Harrison Burke and Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious family law firms. Michael Harrison, Eduardo's longtime attorney and one of the most respected lawyers in the city, slid the legal documents across the polished mahogany table. Emergency custody petition. He's claiming you're mentally unstable due to postpartum depression and that Emma is in immediate danger. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she scanned the paperwork. Emma was sleeping peacefully in her car seat beside Sarah's chair, completely unaware that her father was trying to take her away from the only parent who had ever truly wanted her. But that's insane. I don't have postpartum depression. I'm fine. I'm better than I've been in years. Richard is also claiming that you've been effectively kidnapped by Eduardo and are being held against your will, Michael continued, his tone grim as he turned through the pages of the legal filing. He's painted you as a vulnerable new mother who has been manipulated by a billionaire with questionable motives. Eduardo, who had been pacing behind Sarah's chair like a caged animal, struck the conference table with enough force to make the water glasses jump. "That son of a—" "Eduardo," Sarah said quietly, glancing down at Emma. "Language, the baby." Even in the middle of her panic, her maternal instincts were already firmly in place. Eduardo looked at his 3-day-old granddaughter and immediately softened, his expression shifting from raw fury to fierce protectiveness. "Sorry, sweetheart, but Sarah, this is precisely what abusers do when they lose their grip on you. When they can no longer manipulate you directly, they reach for the legal system as another weapon. They know exactly which buttons to press to make you appear unstable or unfit as a parent." Michael nodded grimly. "The good news is that emergency custody petitions require evidence of immediate danger to the child. Richard's filing is mostly accusations without substantial supporting proof. He's banking on the reality that judges take any allegations involving newborns very seriously." "What's the bad news?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. "The bad news is that family court judges err on the side of caution when infant safety is in question. They will likely order a temporary custody evaluation, which means social workers, psychological assessments, home visits, and possibly supervised visitation arrangements until we can demonstrate that Richard's claims have no basis in fact." Sarah felt hot, angry tears threatening to spill over. "They'll take Emma away from me." "Not necessarily," Michael said quickly, "but there will very likely be restrictions. Court-appointed monitors, scheduled visitation, documentation requirements. The goal of the court will be to maintain the status quo while the investigation moves forward." "How long will that take?" Eduardo asked, his jaw visibly clenched with the effort of keeping his temper in check. "Could be weeks, could be months. Family court moves slowly, especially when serious allegations are involved. Have you ever felt like the very systems that exist to protect people were being turned into weapons against you? Like the institutions that were supposed to help were instead being used to cause harm?" Sarah looked down at Emma's perfect sleeping face and thought about all the years she had spent struggling to have a child, the 3 miscarriages that had broken her heart, the overwhelming joy she had felt when she finally held her healthy daughter in her arms. The thought of being separated from Emma, even temporarily, was more than she could bear. "There has to be something we can do," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Michael hesitated, exchanging a glance with Eduardo. "There is one option, but it's high risk, and it will make this entire situation very public very quickly." "What kind of option?" Eduardo asked. "We could file a counter-petition claiming that Richard is the true danger to the child. We document the abuse, the violence, his rejection of Emma immediately after her birth. We make this about his fitness as a parent rather than Sarah's mental state." "But," Sarah prompted, sensing there was more, "but it means this becomes an extremely public and extremely ugly fight. Richard will retaliate with everything he has. He'll do his best to drag Sarah's name through the mud, make accusations about her mental state, and probably attempt to characterize her relationship with you, Eduardo, as somehow inappropriate or financially motivated. Sarah felt caught between two impossible choices. If she did nothing, Richard might use lies and manipulation to take Emma away. If she fought back, her private life would become entertainment for strangers who had no idea what the truth actually looked like. What would you do, Michael, if this were your own daughter and granddaughter? Michael was quiet for a long moment, treating the question with the seriousness it genuinely deserved. I'd fight, but I'd fight intelligently, and I'd make absolutely sure that Richard Williams regretted the day he ever crossed the Blackwell family. A knock on the conference room door interrupted them. Michael's assistant entered with an expression that immediately put everyone on edge. "Mr. Harrison, there are reporters outside, approximately a dozen of them, with cameras in news vans. Someone leaked the custody story to the press." Sarah's heart sank as she understood that her quiet life was over for good. How did they find out so quickly? Eduardo's expression darkened with recognition. "Richard," he called the press himself. "He's trying to control the narrative, to position himself as the concerned father fighting to protect his child from an unstable mother and her manipulative billionaire grandfather." Through the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows, they could already see news vans lining the street below. Reporters were setting up cameras and testing equipment, preparing for what they expected would be a sensational story about wealth, family secrets, and a bitter custody dispute. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, feeling overwhelmed at the prospect of strangers forming opinions about her life based on whatever story Richard chose to tell. Michael smiled grimly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of why Eduardo had chosen him as his attorney. "Now we show Richard Williams exactly what happens when you pick a fight with the wrong family. Eduardo, do you still have contacts at the Times?" "Several. And at the Post, the Journal, and most of the major television networks." "Good, because I believe it's time the public heard the true story of Richard Williams and the way he treats his wife. If he wants to play this out in public, we're going to make absolutely certain the public receives all the relevant facts." Sarah looked between her father and the attorney and realized she was watching two masters of power and strategy at work. These weren't simply wealthy men throwing money at a problem. They were tacticians who understood exactly how to deploy information, relationships, and influence when the people they cared about were under threat. "You really think we can win this?" she asked. Eduardo came around the table and rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "Sarah, I have been fighting battles longer than you have been alive. I have gone up against governments, corporations, and competitors who thought they could intimidate me into retreating. Richard Williams is about to learn that money is merely the beginning of power. Real power is having the right allies, the right information, and the willingness to use both when someone threatens your family." Emma stirred in her car seat, making soft baby sounds that drew everyone's gaze to her innocent face. Sarah reached down to soothe her daughter, stroking her tiny hand with one finger. "Don't worry, baby girl," she whispered. "Mommy is going to make sure you're safe." "We all are," Eduardo added. Outside, the reporters were arranging themselves for what they believed would be a standard custody dispute between a wealthy man and his wife. They had no idea they were about to witness the full power of the Blackwell Empire deployed in defense of family. The battle had begun. But Sarah was no longer fighting alone. "Good evening. I'm Diana Walsh with Channel 7 News. Tonight, a shocking story of wealth, power, and long-buried family secrets that reads like something straight out of a television drama." Sarah sat in Eduardo's penthouse living room with Emma sleeping in her arms, watching her life become public entertainment on the enormous flat-screen television. Her wedding photo with Richard appeared alongside headlines that made her stomach turn. "Custody battle rocks New York elite. Billionaire claims millionaire's wife as long-lost daughter." "Turn it off," Eduardo said from across the room, where he was pacing with the restless energy of a man accustomed to acting and not waiting. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, business associates, and friends who had seen the coverage. No, Sarah said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. I need to know what they're saying about us. I need to know what Emma will read about her own family someday. The news report continued with a prepared statement from Richard's lawyer that painted him as the calm, reasonable party in the dispute. Mr. Williams is deeply concerned about his wife's mental state following the birth of their daughter. Sarah has been manipulated by individuals seeking to exploit her vulnerability during this difficult time. Sarah felt a wave of nausea watching Richard on screen, looking every inch the picture of respectability in his expensive suit, projecting the image of a caring, concerned father while concealing the cruel reality that existed behind closed doors. He had always been extraordinarily skilled at managing his public image. Then the reporter's tone shifted in a way that made Sarah sit up straighter. However, Channel 7 News has obtained exclusive hospital records and witness statements that paint a dramatically different picture of the Williams marriage. Sarah looked sharply at Eduardo, who was now wearing a grim, satisfied expression. You didn't waste a moment, she said. When someone attacks my family, I respond quickly and decisively, he replied. Margaret knows people, and those people know other people. The truth has a way of traveling when the right individuals want it to travel. Hospital security footage from the day of Emma's birth shows Mr. Williams striking his wife in the delivery room just minutes after their daughter was born. The grainy footage played on screen. Even without sound, the violence was unmistakable. Richard's hand making sharp contact with Sarah's face, her head snapping to the side, the horrified reactions of the medical staff frozen around them. Additionally, multiple hospital employees have confirmed that Mr. Williams rejected his newborn daughter at birth, calling her a failure and declaring that he required a male heir to continue his legacy. Sarah watched Richard's carefully constructed public image crumbling in real time. The penthouse phone immediately began to ring, and Eduardo moved to answer it. Don't take any media calls, he advised Sarah. Michael's office is managing all press inquiries. We want to control the message. But the caller ID showed it was Margaret, and Eduardo accepted the call, placing it on speaker so Sarah could hear. Sarah, honey, are you watching the news? Margaret's voice carried a mixture of satisfaction and genuine concern. Yes, Mom, Sarah said. The words still felt unfamiliar on her tongue, but increasingly right. Did you really give them the hospital footage? Margaret's laugh was musical but carried an edge to it. Darling, I've been friends with Diana Walsh for 20 years. We sit on 3 charity boards together. Our husbands play golf at the same club. We've supported each other through divorces and deaths and various scandals over the years. When she called asking about the custody story, I simply ensured she had access to all the relevant facts. Eduardo stepped away and took the phone off speaker. Margaret, you are brilliant, but is Sarah ready for what comes next? Because Richard is not going to absorb this quietly. You're right, Margaret said, and Sarah could hear the worry threading into her voice. Richard is going to be furious and humiliated. Men like him do not handle public embarrassment well, particularly when it threatens their business reputation. As though summoned by the conversation itself, Sarah's personal phone began buzzing with an incoming call from Richard. She stared at the screen, frozen by years of deeply ingrained conditioning that told her to answer whenever he called, no matter what. Answer it, Eduardo said firmly, but put it on speaker. I want to hear whatever he has to say, and I want witnesses to any threats he makes. Sarah's hand trembled as she accepted the call and activated the speaker function. You think you're clever? Richard's voice was pure venom, loaded with fury and humiliation. You think your billionaire daddy can protect you from the consequences of what you've done? Richard, please, Sarah began, but he cut her off without hesitation. Shut up. Just shut up and listen to me for once in your pathetic life. You've embarrassed me in front of the entire city, made me look like some kind of monster on television. You are a monster, Sarah said, and she was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "You hit me, Richard, in front of doctors and nurses. You called our baby a failure. She is a failure, just like her mother. 15 years I wasted on you. And what do I have to show for it? A wife who can't give me a son and runs away the moment things get difficult." Eduardo stepped closer to the phone, his presence lending Sarah a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "And now you are going to pay for this betrayal," Richard continued, his voice escalating toward near shouting. "Both of you. I'm going to drag this custody fight out for years. I'm going to make sure every detail of your pathetic life becomes public knowledge. I'm going to destroy your reputation and your precious foundation. I'm going to—" "Richard." Eduardo's voice cut cleanly through the tirade, quiet but carrying absolute authority. "This is Eduardo Martinez Blackwell." The line went completely silent, broken only by the sound of Richard's heavy breathing. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to end this quietly and walk away with some degree of dignity remaining." Eduardo continued in that same steady, controlled tone. "Drop the custody petition. Agree to a fair divorce settlement. Stay away from my daughter and my granddaughter. Do that, and you can rebuild your life and your business without any interference from me." "Go to hell," Richard snarled, but there was noticeably less conviction behind the words. "Wrong answer." Eduardo's voice remained perfectly calm, which somehow made it even more unsettling. "You see, Richard, over the past few hours I've been making a number of calls. To the bank that holds your primary construction loan. To the City Planning Commission currently reviewing your Harbor Point development project. To the investors in your pension fund syndication." Sarah could hear Richard's breathing becoming heavier, more agitated. "You have 24 hours to withdraw your legal filings and accept the divorce terms my lawyers will send over. If you fail to do so, I will systematically dismantle everything you've spent your life building. Your business, your reputation, your financial future. All of it." "You can't do that. There are laws." "I'm not describing anything illegal, Richard. I'm describing the perfectly legal consequences of your choices. You might want to speak to Marcus Hendris about it." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "How do you know about Marcus?" "Marcus Hendris was your largest investor until approximately 1 hour ago. He has just withdrawn from your Harbor Point project after I shared some concerns with him about your character and judgment. $42 million in financing. Gone." The line went dead. Richard had hung up. Sarah stared at the phone and then looked at Eduardo. "Did you really just dismantle a $40 million real estate deal with a single phone call?" "I ended a professional relationship between someone I know and someone who threatened my family," Eduardo said calmly. Richard just learned what happens when a person with real power chooses to use it to protect the people they love. On the television, the news had moved on to the weather forecast, but Sarah knew the damage was irreversible. By morning, everyone in New York would know the truth about Richard Williams and exactly how he had treated his wife and their newborn daughter. "Is it over?" she asked, barely daring to voice the hope. Eduardo looked at his granddaughter sleeping with complete serenity, despite the storm swirling around the circumstances of her birth. "It's just beginning, sweetheart. But now Richard understands what he's truly up against. And I don't believe he's going to like his odds." Emma made a soft sound in her sleep, and Sarah gently adjusted her position. Her daughter would grow up in a world where she was protected, valued, and loved without condition. That was worth every bit of public scrutiny and media attention that came with it. The storm was far from finished, but for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Sarah felt like she was standing on the winning side. The Blackwell Industries headquarters occupied 43 floors of prime Manhattan real estate, and this particular morning it hummed with the focused energy of a military operation. Sarah sat in Eduardo's corner office on the 43rd floor, Emma sleeping in a portable crib that had appeared overnight, watching her father coordinate what could only be described as corporate warfare. Jenkins, I want the Harbor Point permits held up in review indefinitely. Eduardo spoke into his phone while simultaneously working through a spread of documents across his massive mahogany desk. Environmental concerns, traffic impact assessments, neighborhood character studies, whatever it takes to slow the approval process. No, Jenkins, indefinitely means indefinitely. Sarah watched the whole operation with a sense of quiet awe. In less than 24 hours, Eduardo had mobilized an entire network of business contacts, political connections, and financial leverage points she hadn't known existed. She was beginning to understand that her father's power extended far beyond money. He had spent decades carefully building relationships and earning influence that could be activated precisely when it was needed most. Michael Harrison appeared in the doorway, his normally composed manner replaced by something that looked almost like barely contained excitement. Eduardo, we have news. Richard's lawyer called 20 minutes ago. He wants to negotiate already. Sarah looked up from the Blackwell Foundation's annual report she had been reading. But you said this could take months. Michael's grin transformed his otherwise serious face. That was before your father reminded half of New York exactly why no one crosses the Blackwell family. Richard has lost 3 major investors since yesterday. 2 bank loans are being called in for review, and the city council just announced it's launching an investigation into complaints about his construction practices. Eduardo ended his call and joined them, settling into one of the leather chairs grouped around the small conference table. What's he offering? Full custody to Sarah, with reasonable visitation rights for Richard. He retains his current assets, but pays child support and alimony in accordance with state guidelines. And Eduardo's tone suggested there was more. He wants a guarantee that the business pressure stops immediately. He is hemorrhaging money by the hour, and his remaining investors are growing nervous about their exposure. Sarah looked between the 2 men, these masters of power and strategy, who were quietly dismantling her millionaire husband's empire with surgical efficiency. Is that enough? What if he changes his mind later? What if he decides to fight for custody when Emma is older? He won't, Eduardo said with complete certainty, because he will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement with substantial financial penalties attached. If he ever harasses you or Emma again, if he violates the visitation terms, if he speaks so much as a single negative word about you in public, it will cost him everything he has left. A knock on the office door preceded Eduardo's assistant, whose expression immediately put everyone on alert. Mr. Blackwell, there is a Mr. Williams here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's insisting. Security is with him. Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach as the familiar fear rushed back through her. Richard's here? In the building? Send him in, Janet, Eduardo said without a trace of concern in his voice. But please have security remain just outside in case Mr. Williams has difficulty managing his temper. Richard entered the office like a man walking to his own execution. His usually immaculate hair was out of place. His expensive suit was creased as though he had slept in it. Dark shadows beneath his eyes suggested he had not slept much, if at all. He looked like a man who had spent the night watching his carefully built world collapse around him, piece by piece. Eduardo, Sarah. His voice was tight with barely suppressed anger, but underneath it was something else, something that might, for the first time, have been genuine fear. Richard. Eduardo gestured toward a chair with impeccable courtesy. Please, sit down. We have a great deal to discuss, and I imagine you're eager to resolve things quickly. I'm not here to negotiate. Richard remained standing, both hands balled into fists at his sides. I'm here to tell you both that you have made a serious mistake. Sarah instinctively moved closer to Emma's portable crib, her protective instincts fully activated, even with security positioned just beyond the door. Even now, backed into a corner and desperate, Richard still radiated a threatening energy that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. Have we? Eduardo's tone was conversational, but his hand moved quietly toward the panic button on his desk. You think money fixes everything. You think you can simply wave your hand and make people disappear, as though they never mattered? Richard's voice climbed higher, more erratic. But I built my business from absolutely nothing. I've survived economic collapses, hostile takeovers, city politics that would have broken lesser men. I am not going to be undone by some old man with a guilty conscience and more money than common sense. Richard, Sarah said quietly, finding her voice despite the fear still moving through her. Just sign the papers. Take the deal. It's generous, and it lets you leave with your dignity. Generous? Richard let out a hollow laugh, stripped of any real humor. Sarah, you have no idea what you've set in motion. This man isn't your father. He's a predator using you to make himself feel better about abandoning your mother 24 years ago. Eduardo rose to his feet slowly, every movement deliberate and measured. I think you should leave now, Richard. Before you say something you will regret even more than what you've already said. Oh, I'm leaving, but not before I tell you both some hard truths that neither of you wants to face. Richard turned to Sarah, his eyes carrying that particular brand of malicious satisfaction he reserved for moments when he believed he had found the most vulnerable spot to strike. You think this is some kind of fairy tale, that you're suddenly a princess because you discovered your father is wealthy. You are still the same inadequate woman who couldn't give me a son, the same failure who needed fertility treatments just to conceive at all. Sometimes the cruelest words come from the people who once claimed to love us. But their cruelty tells us everything about who they are and nothing at all about who we are. Sarah felt the familiar sting of Richard's words, but something fundamental had shifted in the way she received them. Instead of the crushing shame she would once have felt, she found herself thinking with crystalline clarity about what he was actually doing, trying to hurt her because he was losing control and had never learned any other way to respond. You're right about one thing, Richard, she said, moving to stand beside Eduardo. I am the same woman who struggled with fertility, the same woman who wanted a family so desperately that she stayed with a man who hit her and told her she was worthless. But do you know what else I am? Richard stared at her, visibly caught off guard by her refusal to shrink. I am the woman who endured 18 hours of labor to bring our daughter into the world while you were closing a business deal. I am the woman who loved you for 15 years despite your cruelty and abuse. I am the woman who is strong enough to walk away from you and build something better for Emma. Sarah drew strength from the solid presence of Eduardo beside her. And yes, I am Eduardo Martinez Blackwell's daughter, which means Emma is his granddaughter, which means she will grow up knowing she is loved, valued, and powerful enough to choose her own path in this world. Richard's face contorted with rage and frustration. You think this conversation is? I think this conversation is over. Eduardo's voice was quiet and absolute, with the finality of someone who decides when discussions end. Security will see you out. You have until 5 o'clock today to sign the agreement. Michael's office will send you. After that point, the offer expires and we proceed to trial. Fine, Richard snarled, his last shreds of composure finally giving way entirely. But don't think for a second that this is finished. I'll find another way to hurt you both. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of people you really are. As security escorted Richard from the office, Sarah realized she was trembling, not with fear, but with adrenaline, and something that felt remarkably like victory. For the first time in her marriage, she had faced Richard without backing down, without apologizing, without rushing to minimize the damage he was creating. Are you all right? Eduardo asked gently, his hand resting on her shoulder. Actually, yes. I think I really am. Sarah looked down at Emma, still sleeping peacefully despite everything swirling around her. Is he actually going to sign? Michael, who had remained diplomatically silent throughout the entire confrontation, smiled with professional satisfaction. He'll sign. His lawyer called again while he was up here making threats. 3 more investors just withdrew from his projects, and his primary lender is calling in their loan. Richard Williams is approximately 12 hours away from bankruptcy. Eduardo checked his watch, a small gesture that somehow conveyed both precision and quiet inevitability. In that case, I think it's time you were introduced to the rest of the Blackwell Foundation board. You start your new position on Monday. Monday? But Emma is only 4 days old. The foundation offices are on the 20th floor of this building. We have a full daycare facility, private nursing rooms, and complete scheduling flexibility to accommodate whatever you and Emma need. She can come to work with you every day if that's what you want. Sarah looked around the office, taking in the view of Central Park spreading out below. The family photographs Eduardo had already placed on his desk, including one of her and Emma taken at the hospital, and the oil portrait hanging behind his chair with a small brass plaque that read, Maria Elena Martinez Blackwell, 1960 to 2019, beloved wife and partner. For the first time since Emma's birth, she felt entirely like she was exactly where she belonged. "What will I be doing at the foundation?" she asked. "Changing lives," Eduardo said simply, "starting with your own." At exactly 4:57 in the afternoon, Richard Williams walked into the conference room at Harrison Burke and Associates, looking like a man attending his own funeral. His attorney, Marcus Gold, followed close behind, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing the resigned expression of someone who had spent the entire day explaining to his client why surrender was the only remaining option. Sarah sat at the far end of the polished mahogany conference table with Emma sleeping in her arms, Eduardo steady on one side of her and Michael Harrison on the other. The contrast between the two sides of the table was striking. Sarah's side radiated calm confidence. Richard looked as though he was barely holding himself together. "Mr. Williams," Michael said formally, his voice carrying the weight of legal finality, "are you prepared to sign the custody and divorce agreements as previously outlined?" Richard dropped into his chair with the posture of a man who had run completely out of options. "Do I have a choice?" "There is always a choice," Eduardo said quietly, his tone neutral, but his meaning absolutely clear. "But some choices carry consequences no one can live with." Marcus Gold spread the documents across the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had overseen many such capitulations. "My client agrees to all terms as specified, full custody to Mrs. Williams, reasonable visitation rights for Mr. Williams, child support and alimony calculated according to state guidelines, and the comprehensive non-disclosure provisions." Sarah watched Richard's face as Marcus read through the terms that would shape the rest of their lives. She was surprised to find herself feeling almost sorry for him. Almost. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish green, but she could still feel the echo of his hands striking her face in that delivery room. "Richard," she said softly, her voice carrying none of the fear that had defined their relationship for so many years. "The visitation schedule gives you every other weekend once Emma is older, plus alternating holidays. You don't have to disappear entirely from her life." Richard looked up at her with something that might have been genuine surprise. "After everything I've done to you, everything I've said, you still want me to be part of her life?" "I want Emma to have the opportunity to know her father, the real version of you. If that person still exists underneath all the anger and the need for control." Sarah adjusted Emma carefully in her arms, the baby's solid weight anchoring her in the present moment. "But only if you can learn to be the kind of father she deserves. One who sees her value, not just what she can provide." For just a moment, Richard's carefully built armor slipped, and Sarah caught a brief glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with 15 years ago. Ambitious, but not yet cruel. Driven, but not yet consumed by the compulsion to control everything around him. Then his jaw tightened again, and the walls went back up. "Let's just get this done," he muttered, reaching for the first document. The signing process took nearly a full hour, page after page of legal documents that formally ended Sarah's marriage and began Emma's new life as a member of the Blackwell family. Child support calculated as a percentage of Richard's income, structured in a way that would motivate him to rebuild his business responsibly. Alimony that would give Sarah complete financial independence for the first time in her adult life. And the non-disclosure agreement that would protect her from Richard ever publicly attacking her or the Blackwell family. When the final signature was complete, Michael gathered all the documents with evident satisfaction. That concludes our business, Mr. Williams. You have 48 hours to vacate the marital home. Mrs. Williams will arrange to collect her personal belongings at a mutually convenient time. Actually, Sarah said, her voice surprising everyone at the table, I don't want anything from that house. Nothing except my photo albums and Emma's nursery furniture. Richard looked up sharply. Nothing? But there are antiques worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Artwork, jewelry, things you chose yourself, things that made you happy. I want to start fresh, Sarah said. Everything new, everything chosen by me, for me and Emma. As Richard and his attorney prepared to leave, he paused with his hand resting on the door handle. Sarah, for what it's worth, I am sorry. About the hospital, about hitting you, about all of it. Sarah met his gaze directly, no longer flinching from his attention or his judgment. I know you are, Richard, but being sorry doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't erase the fear, and it doesn't rebuild what was broken. And it doesn't guarantee it won't happen again. It won't. I swear to you on everything I have left. You swore to love and honor me too, in front of everyone we knew. Sarah's voice was sad but grounded, carrying the quiet wisdom that comes from finally understanding your own value. I can't build Emma's life on your promises anymore. I have to build it on my own choices and on the family that chooses to stand beside those choices. After Richard was gone, the conference room felt lighter, as though a long, oppressive storm system had finally moved off. Eduardo reached over and gently touched Emma's cheek with one finger. It's done, sweetheart. You're free. Free, Sarah repeated the word as though tasting it for the first time. I'm not sure I remember what that feels like. You'll learn, Michael said warmly, organizing the signed documents into a careful stack. And you'll have plenty of support along the way. Eduardo reached into his briefcase and produced another folder. Speaking of which, there is one more document to review today, if you're ready. Sarah looked at him curiously. Your employment contract with the Blackwell Foundation. Starting salary is $300,000 per year, with full benefits and a performance-based bonus tied to the foundation's outcomes and your own contributions. Sarah's eyes widened as she attempted to process the number. $300,000. But I've never worked in philanthropy. I've never had a real professional position outside the home. You spent 15 years managing a household with a staff of 6, organizing charity events that raised millions of dollars, coordinating social functions for Richard's business associates. You ran fundraisers for the hospital, the Children's Museum, the animal shelter. Eduardo smiled with unmistakable paternal pride. You have been doing foundation work throughout your entire marriage, Sarah. You simply weren't being paid for it, and you weren't receiving any credit for what you accomplished. But what if I'm not good at it? What if I disappoint you? Then you will learn from your mistakes and improve, just as everyone does. But Sarah, I have watched you build events that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for causes you believed in. I've seen the way you connect with people, the way you make them feel genuinely heard and inspired to contribute to something larger than themselves. That ability is not something you can teach in a classroom. It's something that lives in you. Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, opening her eyes for the first time since the meeting had begun. She gazed around the room with the unfocused look of a newborn, but when her eyes found Sarah's face, she seemed to focus with the intensity that babies reserve exclusively for the most important person in their world. Hi, baby girl, Sarah whispered, her voice full of wonder and love. Mommy just signed some very important papers. Papers that mean you are going to grow up safe and loved and free to become exactly whoever you choose to be. Eduardo leaned over to look at his granddaughter, his face open with a kind of love that goes beyond language. She's beautiful, Sarah. Margaret was right. She has your mother's eyes and my stubborn chin. Mom is coming to dinner tonight, Sarah said, still marveling at having a mother again after so many years of believing herself to be entirely alone. She wants to properly meet Emma and to tell me more about why she left you all those years ago. Are you ready for that conversation? Sarah considered the question honestly, taking stock of how completely her life had shifted in just a few short days. 24 hours earlier, she had been trapped in an abusive marriage with no visible path forward and no resources to create a different kind of life. Now she was divorced, financially independent, reunited with her father, about to step into a meaningful career and raising her daughter surrounded by family who actively chose each other. I'm ready for anything, she said, and for the first time in years, she meant every word completely. Outside the conference room windows, the sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, painting the sky in warm shades of gold and deep pink. Sarah could see people hurrying home from work, heading to dinner with people they loved, moving through their lives with the kind of freedom she was only now beginning to grasp as her own. Tomorrow, she would be one of them. A working mother building a future for her daughter on her own terms, shaped by her own values. Thank you, she said to Eduardo, her voice thick with feeling, for everything, for finding me, for protecting us, for giving me the chance to become who I was always meant to be. Eduardo's eyes were bright with tears he was working to hold back. Sarah, I am the one who should be thanking you. You've given me something I believed I had lost forever the night your mother disappeared. Family. Real family, built on love and deliberate choice rather than obligation. Emma made a soft cooing sound, and both adults broke into smiles at the uncomplicated innocence of it. Come on, Eduardo said, rising and offering Sarah his arm. Let's go home and introduce this little one to her grandmother properly, and then we'll begin planning the rest of your lives. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Sarah recognized something she hadn't felt in her adult life before. She was walking toward her future instead of running from her past. The difference felt like the difference between merely surviving and actually, genuinely living. The penthouse dining room glowed with warm candlelight as Sarah, Eduardo, and Margaret shared their first dinner together in 24 years. The table was dressed with Eduardo's finest china and crystal, but the atmosphere was intimate rather than formal. An overdue family reunion finally taking place. Emma slept peacefully in her bassinet nearby, the soft sounds she made drawing everyone's attention and filling the quiet moments with gentle, wondering delight. She is absolutely perfect, Margaret said, for what felt like perhaps the 100th time, unable to stop looking at her granddaughter. She looks exactly as you did as a baby, Sarah. The same delicate features, the same peaceful expression when she sleeps. Tell me about that, Sarah said gently, settling back in her chair with a cup of herbal tea. Tell me about when I was born. Tell me about you and Eduardo. I need to understand the whole story. Margaret set down her wine glass and looked across the table at Eduardo, her eyes holding decades of regret and a love that had clearly never fully faded. Are you sure you want to hear all of it? Some of it isn't easy, and some of it might change the way you see both of us. I need to know, Mom. I need to understand why you allowed me to believe you were dead for most of my life. I need to understand what happened between the two of you that made decades of lies feel necessary. Eduardo reached across the table and took Margaret's hand in a gesture so natural it seemed as though they had been doing it across dinner tables for years, rather than being separated by choices made long ago. It's all right, Margaret. We're all adults now. The past cannot hurt us anymore unless we choose to let it. Margaret took a slow breath, drawing courage from Eduardo's steadiness. I was 19 when I met Eduardo. He was 25, in his second year of medical school, working 3 jobs to cover his tuition. I was supposed to be focusing on my studies at Barnard, but I couldn't think about anything except this brilliant, passionate man who talked about changing the world through medicine. But you fell in love with the medical student without the fortune instead of the suitors your family had selected, Sarah said, already recognizing the pattern of family expectation and the quiet rebellion of the heart. I fell in love with the most brilliant, ambitious, generous-hearted man I had ever encountered. Margaret smiled across at Eduardo, and Sarah could see the young woman she had once been shining through. He was everything my parents' approved suitors were not: passionate about his work, completely indifferent to my family's money, determined to succeed entirely on his own terms. Eduardo's voice was soft with feeling. You were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. But more than that, you were intelligent, funny, and completely your own person. You pushed me to think bigger, to want more than just financial achievement. You made me believe I could build something genuinely meaningful. What happened when you found out I was pregnant? Sarah asked, though she already suspected the broad shape of what had followed. Margaret's face grew heavy with regret. I was terrified. We weren't married. I was still in college, and I knew my parents would be furious. But Eduardo, she looked at him with a love that had clearly never been entirely extinguished. Eduardo was overjoyed. I wanted to marry you immediately, Eduardo said, the words carrying the warmth of a younger man's conviction. I didn't care about your parents' opinion, or their wealth, or their social standing. I was ready to leave medical school, take any work I could find, support our family however necessary. My parents had other plans, Margaret said, and her voice took on an edge of old, never fully resolved anger. They arranged a meeting with Eduardo at their attorney's office. I was not included, of course. Women weren't considered capable of participating in decisions of that kind. Sarah looked at her father. What did they say to you? Eduardo's jaw tightened at the memory. They offered me $50,000 to remove myself from your mother's life and never contact her again. When I refused and told them I loved Margaret and intended to marry her, they laid out in precise detail how they would destroy my medical career before it had even properly begun. But that's illegal. Legal doesn't matter when you have sufficient money and influence. Margaret's voice carried a lifetime of bitterness. They had the power to do exactly what they threatened: false accusations, ruined references, blacklisting from every hospital and medical program in the country. They could have ensured Eduardo never practiced medicine. So you took their money and left? Sarah kept her voice as even as she could manage. I thought I was protecting him. Margaret's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for decades. I was young and frightened, and I believed them when they told me Eduardo would be better off without the weight of an unwanted family. So I took their $5,000, not $50,000. They lied about that as well. And I disappeared. Eduardo leaned forward, his voice carrying the urgency of remembered desperation. Margaret, I searched for you for years. Private investigators, newspaper advertisements, every resource I could access. I spent every dollar I could spare trying to find you and our child. I changed my name and moved to California. I found work waitressing while I completed my degree at night. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. When you were 3, Sarah, I met James, your stepfather. He was kind and stable, and he never pressed for the details of your history, and he never once questioned who your father was. But why did you allow me to believe you were dead? Sarah asked, the question she most needed answered. When I was 18, James told me you had died in a car accident. He showed me a death certificate. Margaret and Eduardo exchanged a glance heavy with shared weight. Because I asked him to, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. When you turned 18, I wanted to reach out to you. I wanted to tell you about Eduardo, about the choices I had made and why. But James argued that it would only cause you pain. You had a stable life. You were about to begin college at Northwestern. You had friends and plans and a future that was just opening up. He believed that reappearing in your life and upending all of that with the truth about a mother who had been absent would be cruel and selfish rather than kind. So I legally changed my identity when I married James and became Margaret Chen. And I allowed Margaret Thompson to officially die in a car accident that never happened. It seemed like the kindest thing I could do for you at the time." Sarah sat with the full weight of it for a long moment. "My entire life has been built on lies that were meant to protect me." "Not lies," Eduardo said gently. "Choices made by people who loved you and wanted to shield you from pain. Perhaps the wrong choices, but made with real love by people navigating impossible circumstances." Emma shifted in her bassinet, and Sarah automatically reached over to soothe her. The physical act of comforting her daughter brought her back to the present. Whatever had been done in the past, Emma would grow up knowing the full truth about her family. "I understand why you made the choices you did," Sarah said slowly, her voice carrying more strength than she expected. "But I need you both to promise me something." "Anything," Margaret and Eduardo said at the same moment, their voices overlapping. "No more secrets, no more lies, even the well-meaning kind. Emma deserves to know her family's history, all of it, the good parts and the difficult parts, and the complicated places that resist easy explanation." "Agreed," Eduardo said without hesitation. "Completely agreed," Margaret added. "No more sheltering people from truth. The truth is better than protection, even when it's painful." They sat in a comfortable, unhurried silence for a few minutes, watching Emma sleep and allowing the weight of decades to quietly settle around them. Then Eduardo spoke again. "Sarah, there's something else, something I'd like to discuss with both of you." "What is it?" "I want to formally adopt you. Change your name legally to Sarah Blackwell, if that's something you would want. I know you're an adult, but I want there to be no ambiguity about your place in this family or about Emma's inheritance." Sarah felt fresh tears rising. "You want to adopt me?" "I want to make up for 24 years of missed birthdays, missed Christmas mornings, missed bedtime stories. I want to walk you down the aisle if you ever choose to remarry. I want to spoil Emma completely rotten and teach her to drive one day and intimidate her first boyfriends when she's 16. Margaret smiled through her own tears. "That's beautiful, Eduardo. It's what should have happened 24 years ago." "What about you, Mom?" Sarah asked. "What are your plans now that we're all back in each other's lives?" Margaret looked at Eduardo with an expression full of quiet hope, and Sarah could see the young woman she had once been, peering through the elegant composure of the woman she had become. "Actually, Eduardo and I have been talking about perhaps trying once more. We're older now, and considerably wiser. We both know exactly what it feels like to lose each other, and we have no interest in wasting whatever time we have left." Sarah looked between her parents, and the word felt completely natural now, and saw something she had never imagined she would witness. A love story being offered a second chance after decades of loss and regret. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Eduardo asked. "Are you ready to have your whole family together? All of us. The way it always should have been." Sarah looked around the table at the people who loved her, and then down at Emma, sleeping with complete peace in her bassinet. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of belonging so complete it filled every hollow space inside her. They say you can't choose your family, but sometimes the universe offers you a second chance to find the family you were always meant to have. Sometimes the family that comes looking for you is precisely the family your heart has been waiting for. "I think Emma is going to be the luckiest little girl in the world," Sarah said, her voice full of gratitude and wonder. "She is going to grow up surrounded by people who chose to love each other, even when it was difficult, even when it took 24 years to find the way back." Outside the windows, New York City glittered with countless lights, each one representing another person's story, another family's journey, another heart making its way toward love and the place where it belonged. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably nursing his wounds and looking for his next angle. But here, in this warm room lit with candlelight and the quiet miracle of reunion, Sarah felt completely and entirely safe. Her past was complicated, her present was challenging, but her future, Their future was luminous with promise. To new beginnings, Eduardo said, raising his glass. To family, Margaret added, lifting hers. To love that is stronger than fear, Sarah finished, bringing her water glass gently to meet theirs. As they toasted, Emma stirred in her bassinet and made a soft sound that seemed to carry its own quiet blessing. The Blackwell family was finally whole. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her office on the 20th floor of the Blackwell Industries building, looking out at Central Park in the full glory of autumn. The leaves had turned to brilliant shades of gold and deep red, and the morning sun made everything look like a painting deserving of a place on the walls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. "Mama, Mama, Mama!" Emma babbled from her playpen in the corner of the office, her chubby little hands reaching for the colorful toys dangling above her head. At 6 months old, she was a happy, thriving baby who had become the unofficial spirit of the Blackwell Foundation and the particular joy of every person in the building. "Good morning, beautiful girl," Sarah said, scooping Emma up for their morning ritual of closeness. "Are you ready for Grandpa's big announcement today?" The Blackwell Foundation had flourished under Sarah's leadership in ways that had genuinely surprised even Eduardo. In 6 months, she had overseen the distribution of $25 million to causes ranging from domestic violence shelters to children's hospitals to environmental initiatives. More significantly, she had discovered her calling. Every grant awarded and every family supported felt like one more thread of healing woven into her own story. A knock at the office door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Eduardo entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the broadest smile she had yet seen from him. He was dressed in his finest suit, and the energy around him suggested that something significant was about to happen. "Good morning, my girls. How are we on this beautiful October morning?" "We are wonderful," Sarah said, settling Emma on her hip with the practiced ease of a mother 6 months into her stride. "You look like you have news, and knowing you, it's probably news that's going to change our lives again." "Indeed it is." Eduardo handed her a coffee and tweaked Emma's nose gently, drawing a delighted giggle from the baby. "The adoption papers were filed this morning. As of today, you are officially Sarah Margaret Blackwell. And Emma Martinez Blackwell. I wanted her to carry something from both sides of her heritage, her Mexican roots and her new future." Sarah felt tears of joy beginning. Even after everything they had navigated and all the legal complexities and media scrutiny, it still felt almost impossible to accept that the transformation of her life was real and permanent. "It's really official. I'm really your daughter in the eyes of the law. You have always been my daughter, sweetheart. Now the law simply agrees. And no one can ever question your place in this family again." Through the office windows, Sarah could see reporters gathering in the plaza below. Today was the day Eduardo would publicly announce his engagement to Margaret and introduce Sarah to the world as his daughter and the heir to the Blackwell enterprise. The media attention since the custody dispute 6 months earlier had been intense, but Eduardo's public relations team had handled it with remarkable skill. "Are you ready for this?" Eduardo asked, following her gaze to the crowd of cameras and journalists below. "Once we make the announcement, there will be no return to your quiet life. You'll be one of the most recognized women in New York." Sarah considered the question with genuine care. 6 months ago, she had been a frightened, isolated woman, trapped in an abusive marriage with no resources and no visible path towards something better. Now she was directing a multi-million-dollar foundation, had appeared on the cover of Forbes as a philanthropist to watch, and was about to step into life as one of the most prominent women in the country. "I'm ready," she said, and the confidence in her own voice surprised her. "But first, tell me about Richard. How is he managing? Is he respecting the boundaries of the custody arrangement?" Eduardo's expression softened slightly. "He has been compliant. He sees Emma every other weekend as scheduled, supervised visits until she's older, and can speak for herself if anything feels wrong. He's been civil during the exchanges, but he is struggling financially. He lost the majority of his major investors after the media coverage, and had to sell the Westchester house and significantly scale back his operations. He's in a modest apartment in Queens now and working on considerably smaller projects. Sarah sat with the complexity of her feelings about that. She didn't miss Richard, and she had no regrets about leaving, but she took no pleasure in his difficulties either. Will he be okay eventually? Will he be able to rebuild? Marcus Gold believes he will recover, most likely at a smaller scale than before. He's a survivor, Sarah, and the lessons he's absorbed have been hard ones. He'll find his footing again. And perhaps he'll be a better person for what he's been through. Emma began to fuss, and Sarah automatically began the gentle, rhythmic motion that always settled her. Sometimes I wonder if I pushed too hard, if I unnecessarily destroyed what he had built. The divorce settlement was fair, but the business repercussions. Eduardo took Emma from her arms, and the baby immediately quieted against his shoulder. He had a natural way with his granddaughter that made Sarah ache with quiet sorrow for all the years they had missed together. Sarah, let me tell you something I've learned over 62 years, most of it spent in a world where consequences matter. You are not responsible for the consequences of other people's choices. If you had stayed, if you had returned to him, Emma would be growing up in a home where violence was ordinary, where love was conditional, where women were treated as objects to be managed rather than people to be cherished. Eduardo's voice was firm and kind at once. You did not destroy Richard's life, sweetheart. You saved your own, and Emma's, and possibly even his, if he has the wisdom to learn from what happened. A quiet knock interrupted them. Margaret peered around the door looking radiant in a cream suit that made her silver hair gleam like spun light. The engagement ring on her finger caught the morning sun and sparkled like a promise finally kept. Are my 3 favorite people ready for the press conference? As ready as we're going to be, Sarah said, smoothing her own outfit, a navy dress that struck the precise balance between professional presence and maternal warmth. Sarah, Margaret said, stepping forward to embrace her daughter, I want you to know how proud I am, not just for surviving what you went through with Richard, but for thriving, for building something genuinely beautiful and meaningful from the wreckage of your old life. I had extraordinary teachers, Sarah replied, looking between her parents with a gratitude that overflowed any available words. I had people who showed me what real love is, what healthy relationships feel like, what it means to be valued for who you actually are, rather than for what you can provide or produce. The 3 adults and 1 baby made their way to the elevator that would carry them down through the floors of the building that now represented the shape of Sarah's future. As they descended, she thought about the road that had brought all of them to this moment. The elevator doors opened onto a room full of reporters, cameras, and the sharp white glare of professional lighting. Sarah took a breath deep enough to fill herself entirely, lifted her chin with the confidence she had learned from her father, and stepped into her new life. Ladies and gentlemen, Eduardo began, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone who had long since learned that presence commands attention more reliably than volume. I'd like you to meet my daughter, Sarah Blackwell, and my granddaughter, Emma. They are the future of the Blackwell family and the Blackwell Foundation. As the cameras flashed and questions began arriving from every direction, Sarah felt Emma's tiny hand curl around her finger. She looked down at her daughter's perfect face and made the silent promise she intended to keep for the rest of her life. Emma would grow up knowing she was loved without condition. She would never doubt her own worth. She would never accept less than she deserved. She would never be afraid to use her voice or stand in her own power. She would grow up strong, secure, and surrounded by people who chose each other every single day. The press conference lasted an hour, but Sarah was barely aware of time passing. She answered questions about the Foundation's mission, about her unexpected reunion with Eduardo, about her plans to expand their charitable reach. She spoke with ease and assurance, entirely the philanthropist and inheritor she had worked to become. When it was over, the family retreated to Eduardo's office for a quiet moment of celebration and reflection. "That went beautifully," Margaret said, settling into an armchair with Emma in her lap. "You were magnificent, Sarah. Natural and authoritative and completely at home in your own skin." "I felt magnificent," Sarah admitted, still absorbing her own transformation with something close to wonder. "6 months ago, I could barely order coffee without apologizing to the barista for taking up their time. Today, I announced a $50 million initiative to support survivors of domestic violence and their children." Eduardo produced the champagne he had been keeping in his office refrigerator. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. "To family," Margaret added, lifting hers. "To love that is stronger than fear," Sarah finished, touching her water glass gently to both of theirs. As the glasses met, Emma clapped her small hands together and made them all laugh with pure, uncomplicated joy. The sound rang through the office like something sacred. Through the windows, New York City lay spread before them in all its intricate, living complexity. Sarah had found her place in it. She had found her purpose and her people. She had found herself. The frightened woman who had been struck in a hospital delivery room was gone for good. In her place stood Sarah Blackwell, daughter, mother, philanthropist, survivor. A woman who had come to understand that sometimes the most devastating thing that happens to you can become the doorway to the most extraordinary life you were ever meant to live. Outside, autumn was painting the world in colors that burned with beauty. And inside, a family that had been fractured for too long was finally completely whole. The future had never looked more full of light. And Sarah knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, bound by the kind of love that chooses itself again and again, even across decades and distances, and the long, painful detours of lives imperfectly lived. The millionaire husband who had tried to define and contain her was only a chapter in her story now, not its author, and certainly not its ending. The divorce had given her financial independence, but far more than that, it had returned her to herself. It had shown her the full measure of her own strength, her own worth, and her own capacity to build the life she chose. Women supporting women, she thought, turning the phrase over with gratitude. The nurses in the delivery room, Margaret's precisely timed and perfectly executed use of her social connections. The female reporters who had told her story with both accuracy and compassion. As Emma drifted towards sleep in Margaret's arms, and Eduardo began mapping out the Foundation's next major initiative, Sarah understood that her transformation was complete. She had not merely escaped from an abusive marriage, she had stepped fully into her destiny as a woman with the strength and the platform to help reshape the world for others like herself. The Blackwell legacy would continue through Emma, but it would be shaped by Sarah's deepest values: compassion, justice, the fierce, tireless protection of those who have not yet found their way to safety. That was a legacy worth every sacrifice it had required to build. A future worth fighting for with everything she had. A life worth living in its fullest, most authentic, most joyful expression. The young woman who had once believed she deserved nothing had grown into a woman who knew she deserved everything: love, respect, purpose, and the full and sovereign freedom to choose her own path. And she would make absolutely certain that Emma grew up carrying that same truth in her bones, understanding without question that her own potential had no ceiling and no end.